Before this story even truly begins, I want to speak directly to you. If you've ever clicked on a video like this and felt your chest tighten, not because of what was said, but because of what was almost said, then you're in the right place. If stories about quiet temptation, emotional distance, and the moments that slowly reshape a marriage pull you in, then take a second right now. Subscribe to this channel. Not because it helps an algorithm, but because the stories here don't rush. They unfold. And once you step into them, you don't leave the same. This is not a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about people. And people are rarely simple. When I first met Daniel, he was nothing more than my husband's colleague. At least, that's how it started. That's how I explained it to myself later, when the memory refused to stay quiet. A colleague. A harmless word. Clean. Neutral. Safe. It allowed me to place him neatly into a category that required no further thought, no reflection, no responsibility. Mark worked downtown, in one of those polished firms that look impressive from the outside and exhausting from the inside. Glass walls everywhere. Open-plan offices where privacy didn't exist, but ambition thrived. Men and women in tailored suits who measured time in deadlines and self-worth in promotions. Late nights weren't exceptions, they were expectations. Emails arrived at all hours, and dinners were often eaten alone, reheated, while I scrolled through my phone pretending I wasn't waiting. Mark often talked about Daniel, but always casually. Never with emphasis. Never with detail. Daniel landed us that account. Daniel's the only one who doesn't panic when things fall apart. Daniel stayed late again, guy's a machine. To me, Daniel was just a name that floated through our apartment and disappeared again. One of many. One of those faceless figures who lived in Mark's professional world, shaking hands too firmly at company events, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, speaking in confident tones about numbers that meant nothing to me. I didn't wonder what he looked like. I didn't imagine his voice. I didn't picture his smile. Why would I? My life was already full. Or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. I was Mark's wife. That sentence carried weight once. It used to feel like something solid, something earned. We had met years earlier, back when his ambition felt exciting instead of exhausting. When late nights meant dreaming together, not drifting apart. When silence between us felt comfortable, not heavy. By the time Daniel entered our story, that version of us had faded quietly. Not with arguments or betrayal, just erosion. The slow wearing down of closeness by routine, stress, and unspoken disappointments. So when Mark announced one Tuesday evening that he wanted to host a small dinner at our house for a few colleagues, my first reaction wasn't excitement. It was resignation. I smiled, because that's what wives do. I nodded because pushing back felt like more effort than it was worth. Just a few people, Mark said, loosening his tie. Nothing big. Nothing big. Entertaining his coworkers always felt like stepping into a role I hadn't auditioned for. The supportive spouse. The charming hostess. The woman who smiled at the right moments, laughed politely, and pretended she cared about quarterly projections and office politics. Still, I agreed. That Friday evening arrived faster than I expected. The apartment filled with the quiet tension that always comes before company. The kind where everything suddenly feels inadequate. I cleaned more than necessary. Rearranged furniture that didn't need rearranging. Set the table with my best china, the one we only used when appearances mattered. Candles were lit, not because we needed them, but because they softened things. Made everything look warmer than it felt. I poured wine into crystal glasses and placed them carefully, evenly spaced. Control, in small details, where I could still find it. When it came time to get dressed, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted invisibility done correctly. I chose a simple black dress, elegant, understated. It fit me well, hugged my body just enough to look polished without crossing into obvious. At least, that was the intention. The doorbell rang earlier than expected. Mark was still in the bedroom, adjusting his cufflinks, so I went to answer it. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed wasn't his face. It was his eyes. Green. Striking. Not loud or flashy, but intense in a quiet way. The kind of eyes that didn't just glance, they lingered, as if they were taking inventory of something beneath the surface. He was taller than Mark, broader in the shoulders, standing with an ease that suggested confidence without arrogance. The kind of presence that filled space without demanding it. "Hi," he said, smiling slightly. "You must be Emily." His voice was calm, warm, steady. It carried a natural confidence that didn't feel practiced. "Yes," I replied, suddenly aware of my posture, my hair, the way I was holding the door. "And you're Daniel." He extended his hand. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. Polite. Professional. But it wasn't the handshake that stayed with me. It was the way he looked at me while we shook hands. Not like a man assessing a colleague's spouse. Not like someone being polite. But like someone actually seeing me. As if I were more than a role, more than an accessory to someone else's life. I stepped aside to let him in, telling myself not to be ridiculous. It was just a look. The evening unfolded the way these dinners always did. Guests arrived in waves. Coats were hung. Compliments were exchanged about the apartment, the food, the view. Laughter filled the living room, bouncing off walls that usually echoed with silence. Mark slipped easily into host mode. He thrived there, telling stories, refilling glasses, playing the charismatic professional everyone admired. I moved through the room quietly, gracefully, making sure plates were full, asking questions I didn't care about, smiling when expected. And every so often, without intending to, my eyes drifted toward Daniel. And every time they did, I found his gaze already there. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't inappropriate. It lasted just a second too long to be accidental. A fleeting glance. A subtle acknowledgement. Each time, it left behind a warmth I couldn't explain. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself he was just observant. I told myself it meant nothing. But something inside me stirred, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. By the time dessert was served, the air between us felt charged. Not in a way anyone else would notice. Not in a way that could be pointed to or proven. But I felt it. It lived in the small moments. The way his hand brushed mine when I passed him the wine bottle. The slight tilt of his smile when our eyes met across the table. The quiet awareness of his presence, even when he wasn't speaking. When the night finally began to wind down and guests started to leave, Daniel lingered near the door. Mark was busy saying goodbye to another colleague, laughing about something that had happened at work. For a brief moment, it was just the two of us. "Dinner was wonderful," Daniel said softly. "You really have a gift for making people feel at home." "Thank you," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Then it happened. That look. It wasn't just a glance anymore. It was steady, intentional, an unspoken confession passing silently between us. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The chatter faded. The laughter dulled. Even Mark's voice in the background felt distant. There was only that moment. Then Daniel nodded politely, stepped outside, and the door closed behind him. But the feeling didn't leave. It followed me as I cleared plates, as I rinsed glasses. As Mark talked about office politics I barely heard. Later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, it was still there. Because in that look, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Something dangerous. Something intoxicating. And something I didn't yet understand would change everything. When the door closed behind Daniel, the apartment felt different. Not empty. Not silent. Just altered. It was subtle at first, the way a room feels after a storm has passed. Everything still standing, nothing visibly damaged, but the air charged with something that hadn't been there before. Mark didn't notice. He was still riding the high of the evening, energized by conversation, by validation, by the comfort of being admired in his own space. He talked as he cleared glasses, as he loosened his tie, as he replayed moments from the night that I barely remembered. "Did you hear what Jason said about the merger? Daniel thinks we'll close by Q3. Honestly, tonight went really well." I nodded when expected, smiled when appropriate. responded with practiced sounds of agreement. But my mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was stuck at the doorway. At that look. At the way Daniel's eyes had held mine just a second longer than polite, just long enough to say something neither of us had dared to voice. I told myself it was nothing. That's what we always do first. We minimize. We rationalize. We dismiss the feeling before it has time to grow teeth. I washed dishes longer than necessary, scrubbing plates that were already clean. The warm water ran over my hands, grounding me in something physical, something real. I focused on the sound, the clink of porcelain, the steady rush from the faucet. But even there, in the mundane rhythm of cleanup, he lingered. The brush of his fingers when I passed him the wine. The slight curve of his smile when our eyes met. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, different from the tone he used with everyone else. It meant nothing, I told myself again. Men flirt sometimes without realizing it. People read into things when they're bored. Loneliness has a way of inventing meaning where none exists. Mark finally joined me in the kitchen, wrapping his arms loosely around my waist from behind. A familiar gesture, one that used to make me melt. "Thank you for tonight," he said, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You really outdid yourself." "You're welcome," I replied. It sounded right. It was the right answer. But something about it felt hollow. He kissed my cheek, distracted, already thinking about tomorrow's meetings, next week's deadlines. After a moment, he let go and headed toward the bedroom, calling back something about an early morning. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked the same, technically. Same hair, same face, same body I'd lived in for years. But her eyes looked awake. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Mark fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and steady, one arm draped across the bed toward me out of habit more than intention. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening in fragments. Not the whole night. Just him. I tried to remember exactly what he'd said, searching for something inappropriate, something concrete I could point to and dismiss. But there was nothing obvious. No lines crossed. No words spoken that couldn't be explained away. That was the dangerous part. It was all implication. All suggestion. All what-ifs. Eventually, exhaustion won. But even my dreams betrayed me. I dreamed of standing in a doorway, unable to move forward or back, while someone waited just out of sight. When I woke the next morning, the feeling was still there. Not guilt. Not desire. Awareness. The days that followed should have swallowed the memory. Life usually does that. Work, errands, routine. They blur everything until it loses its sharp edges. But instead of fading, Daniel seemed to surface in the smallest, most unexpected ways. Mark mentioned him more often. Casually. Innocently. "Daniel thinks we should pitch a new angle to the client. Daniel's been under a lot of pressure lately. Daniel asked about you, said dinner was great." That last one landed differently. I kept my expression neutral. "Oh, yeah," Mark said, scrolling through his phone. "He said you were a great host." I nodded as if it meant nothing. But my pulse quickened, traitorous and sudden. Why would he ask about me? I told myself it was politeness. Gratitude. Nothing more. Still, later that afternoon, I caught myself wondering what he was doing at that exact moment. Sitting at his desk, leaning back in his chair, thinking about numbers and spreadsheets and deadlines? Or thinking about me? I hated myself for that thought. So I buried it. Weeks passed. Life settled back into its familiar pattern. Mark worked late. I filled my days with routines, grocery shopping, workouts, lunches with acquaintances I called friends. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, something was shifting. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. I paid more attention to myself. Not in a vain way, but in a curious one. I lingered longer in front of mirrors, noticing details I'd ignored for years. The curve of my shoulders, the way my hair fell when I let it dry naturally. I caught myself choosing outfits with more intention. even when I had nowhere special to go. As if somewhere deep inside, I was preparing. For what, I didn't know. Then came the email. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, sandwiched between newsletters and spam. The subject line was neutral enough. Dinner, thank you. My heart stuttered before my mind caught up. I opened it slowly. Hi, Emily. I hope this isn't strange, but I wanted to personally thank you again for hosting. It was a really nice evening. Mark is lucky. Daniel, that was it. No emojis. No flirtation. Nothing overt. And yet my hands trembled slightly as I read it again. Mark is lucky. The words echoed louder than they should have. I stared at the screen for a long time, my cursor blinking in the empty reply field. I could ignore it. That would be the right thing. The safe thing. Or I could respond politely, briefly, harmlessly. I typed, deleted, retyped. Thank you, Daniel. Glad you enjoyed it. Too cold. It was lovely meeting you. Too personal. I settled on something neutral. You're welcome. I'm glad you had a good time. Emily. I read it 3 times before sending. When I finally clicked send, a strange mix of relief and anticipation washed over me. I told myself that was the end of it. But deep down I knew better. Because once a line has been acknowledged, even quietly, it exists. And lines, once drawn, have a way of being tested. After Daniel's email, nothing dramatic happened. And that, somehow, made everything feel more dangerous. There were no follow-ups. No second message. No excuse to justify thinking about him again. Just silence, clean, polite, and open-ended. Which meant my mind filled in the gaps on its own. Days passed. Then more. The memory of his words didn't fade. It settled. Became part of the background noise of my thoughts. Like a song you don't realize is playing until it suddenly stops. Mark, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to all of it. He moved through life on autopilot, driven by meetings and metrics, stress and ambition. We still shared meals when our schedules aligned. Still slept in the same bed. Still asked each other the necessary questions. How was your day? Fine. Yours? Busy. Our conversations had become efficient, functional, devoid of unnecessary detail. At some point, I realized that Daniel wasn't creating distance between Mark and me. He was simply revealing it. The truth is, the space had been there long before that dinner. It had grown quietly, like mold behind a wall. Hidden, ignored, until something disturbed it enough to make it visible. I started noticing things I'd once brushed aside. How Mark listened just enough to respond, not enough to understand. How he scrolled through his phone while I spoke, nodding without really hearing me. How his touch had become habitual instead of intentional. There was no cruelty in it. No malice. Just absence. One evening I tried to bridge it. We were sitting on the couch, the TV murmuring in the background, neither of us really watching. I turned toward him, studying his face. The familiar lines, the exhaustion etched deeper than it used to be. Do you ever feel like we don't really talk anymore? I asked. The question lingered between us, heavier than I'd intended. Mark blinked, surprised. What do you mean? We're talking now. I hesitated. How do you explain a feeling that lives in what's missing, not what's present? I mean, really talk, I said softly. About things that aren't work, or logistics, or schedules. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Emily, I'm just tired. Work's been insane lately. You know that. I did know. I always knew. I know, I said quickly, already retreating. I just thought, never mind. He reached for my hand, squeezing it briefly. We're fine. That was the end of the conversation. Not because it was resolved, but because there was nowhere else to take it. Later that night, lying awake beside him, I realized something painful. Mark believed we were fine because nothing was wrong enough to demand attention. But nothing being wrong wasn't the same as things being right. A few days later, Mark mentioned Daniel again. Casually. Almost offhand. We might have to work late this Friday, he said over breakfast. Daniel's pushing for a last-minute revision before the presentation. I stirred my coffee, keeping my tone neutral. Oh, yeah. He's intense, but he's good at what he does. There it was again. That name. It landed differently now. Not like a stranger. Not like a concept. Like a person. Friday came, and Mark did work late. Later than usual. I ate dinner alone, the quiet of the apartment pressing in around me. I tried to distract myself, reading, scrolling, half watching something on TV, but my thoughts kept circling back. I wondered if Daniel was still at the office. If Mark was sitting across from him, discussing numbers, oblivious to the fact that his colleague occupied far more space in my mind than he ever should have. I hated that thought. So I pushed it away. And yet, later that night, my phone buzzed. An email notification. My stomach tightened before I even saw the sender. Daniel. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to open it. I hadn't given him my personal email. He must have gotten it from Mark or the guest list, or somewhere innocuous enough to justify it. That didn't make my reaction any less intense. Finally, I opened it. Hi Emily. I hope I'm not bothering you. Mark mentioned he'd be late tonight, and I realized I never properly thanked you again for hosting. It really stuck with me. I don't usually enjoy work events, but that night felt different. I just wanted you to know that. Daniel, my heart pounded. It wasn't explicit. It wasn't inappropriate. But it was intentional. Different. I sat there, phone in hand, feeling the weight of a choice I hadn't expected to face so soon. Responding didn't mean betrayal. Not technically. It was just words. Polite conversation. Human connection. And yet, I typed slowly. Hi Daniel. You're not bothering me. I'm glad you enjoyed the evening. It was nice meeting you too. Emily. I stared at the message before sending it, searching for something, anything, that crossed a line. There was nothing. So I sent it. The reply came almost immediately. I had a feeling you'd respond. Have a good night, Emily. That sentence stayed with me. I had a feeling you'd respond. Not hope. Not assumption. Feeling. As if he understood something about me that even I hadn't fully acknowledged yet. When Mark finally came home, well past midnight, I pretended to be asleep. He kissed my forehead, changed quietly, slid into bed beside me. I lay there, eyes closed, my phone tucked under the pillow like a secret. In the dark, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not desire. Not yet. Recognition. Daniel wasn't chasing me. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't forcing anything into the open. He was waiting. And that somehow made everything feel inevitable. After that night, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way tectonic plates move beneath the surface. Slowly. Invisibly. Inevitably. Daniel didn't flood my inbox. He didn't text constantly. He didn't do anything reckless enough to give me an excuse to shut it down. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He paced himself. Days would pass without a word, just long enough for me to convince myself I'd imagined the connection. Just long enough for my life to settle back into its routine rhythm. And then, quietly, politely, he would reappear. An email. A short message. A simple question. How's your week been? Mark mentioned you enjoy running. Any good routes you'd recommend? Hope you're doing well. Nothing romantic. Nothing explicit. But always intentional. I noticed how my body reacted before my mind did. The quickening of my breath when his name appeared on my screen. The small lift in my chest when I read his words. The way I'd reread his messages, searching not for what he said, but for what he might have meant. I told myself I was overthinking. That this was harmless. That adults could have conversations without them meaning anything more. Still, I never mentioned him to Mark. Not once. That omission felt small at first. Insignificant. A technicality. But secrets don't announce themselves as secrets. They begin as choices we justify. I'd reply when Mark wasn't around. I'd angle my phone away from him without realizing it. I'd delete notifications, Not because there was anything incriminating, but because I didn't want to explain. And the more I hid it, the more real it became. Mark, meanwhile, seemed to drift further into his own world. Work demanded more of him. Stress clung to his shoulders like a second skin. He spoke more but said less. And when he did touch me, it felt automatic. Like checking a box. One night, as we got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. And this time, I knew exactly what was different. I felt seen. Not by Mark. By Daniel. That realization scared me more than anything else. Because being seen awakens parts of you that don't want to go back to sleep. The first time Daniel and I spoke on the phone, it wasn't planned. He called while Mark was in the shower, the sound of running water muffling everything else. My phone buzzed, his name lighting up the screen. I stared at it, frozen. Calling was different. Emails were safe. Written. Controlled. A voice carried tone. Pauses. Breath. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But curiosity, and something deeper, won. Hello. I said quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end, like he hadn't expected me to pick up. Hi, Daniel said. His voice was exactly as I remembered, warm, steady, calm. I'm sorry if this is a bad time. I can call back. No, I said too quickly, then softened it. It's fine. Another pause. I just wanted to hear your voice, he admitted. That probably sounds strange. It did. And yet it didn't. We talked about nothing at first. Safe topics. Work. Weather. The absurdity of office politics. But as the minutes passed, the conversation deepened without effort. He asked about me. Not surface-level questions. Not polite curiosity. Real ones. What makes you feel most like yourself? When was the last time you felt excited about something? Are you happy, Emily? That question landed hard. I didn't answer right away. In the background, the shower turned off. I knew Mark would step out any second. I don't know, I finally said. Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence. I figured, he said gently. Not judgment. Not pressure. Understanding. We ended the call before Mark came out of the bathroom. Polite goodbyes. Nothing dramatic. But when I set my phone down, my hands were shaking. Because something had happened. Something I couldn't undo. From that point on, I became acutely aware of every choice I made. Every reply. Every smile. Every silence. I knew I was walking closer to a line, but I also knew I wasn't ready to step back. Not yet. Daniel never asked me to leave my husband. Never criticized Mark. Never framed himself as an alternative. He simply existed. Present. Attentive. Emotionally available. And that was enough. One evening, weeks later, Mark came home earlier than usual. He seemed lighter, less burdened. He suggested we go out for dinner, just the two of us. I should have been happy. I was conflicted. At the restaurant, candlelight flickered between us. The setting was intimate, familiar. We'd been here before, years ago, when everything between us still felt alive. Mark talked. I listened. But my mind kept drifting. To conversations that flowed without effort. To questions that made me feel interesting again. To someone who noticed when my tone changed. Halfway through dinner, Mark reached across the table and took my hand. We should do this more often, he said. I feel like we've been distant. There it was. Acknowledgement. A door opening. And in that moment, I understood the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't being pulled away from my marriage. I was stepping away from it. Quietly. Deliberately. One choice at a time. Later that night, lying beside Mark, his hand resting on my back, my phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. A message from Daniel. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would feel like. And that was when it hit me, clear, undeniable, terrifying. This wasn't about attraction anymore. It was about connection. And connection, once formed, doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. After that night, I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was doing. That was the most unsettling part. Not the feelings, not even the secrecy, but the clarity. The quiet understanding that each step forward wasn't accidental anymore. It was chosen. I didn't open Daniel's message that night. I turned my phone face down and let it sit there between the lamp and the glass of water, glowing faintly as if it were alive. Mark fell asleep quickly. He always did when he felt satisfied, when he believed something had been repaired simply because it had been acknowledged. His breathing evened out, slow and heavy, his body warm beside mine. I stared into the darkness. I could end it now, I thought. Delete the message. Stop replying. Let the connection fade into memory like so many other almost things in life. That was still possible. But even as I told myself that, I knew the truth. Endings require closure. And this didn't feel finished. The next morning after Mark left for work, I finally picked up my phone. Daniel's message was simple. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about you. I hope that's okay. I read it twice. Then a third time. There was no urgency in his words. No demand. Just honesty, laid bare and unguarded. I should have been alarmed. Instead, I felt understood. I typed back slowly. I was awake too. That was all. 2 sentences. 6 words. And yet, in that moment, something irreversible happened. We began talking every day after that. Not constantly, not obsessively, but consistently. A rhythm formed between us that felt natural, effortless. Messages in the morning. A call here and there when timing allowed. Occasional emails that felt more thoughtful, more deliberate. He learned things about me Mark hadn't asked in years. What music I listened to when I needed to think. How I liked my coffee when I was anxious. The book I'd read 3 times because it made me feel less alone. And I learned about him. That he'd been married once. That it had ended quietly, painfully, without betrayal, but with distance. That he feared becoming invisible in someone else's life again. One afternoon, during a phone call that stretched longer than it should have, he said something that lingered with me long after we hung up. You don't disappear when you talk, he said. Most people do. You don't. I sat there afterward, phone resting against my chest, wondering when I'd started disappearing, and why it took someone else to notice. Mark noticed changes too. Not Daniel specifically, not the messages or the calls, but me. You seem lighter lately, he said one evening. Like you're in a better mood. I smiled. I guess I am. He nodded, satisfied with the explanation. That was the irony of it all. As I drifted further away from him emotionally, I became easier to live with, happier, more present in superficial ways, less demanding, less restless. He thought things were improving. And maybe, in his version of reality, they were. The first real boundary we crossed didn't feel dramatic at all. It happened during lunch. Daniel suggested meeting halfway between our offices, casually, almost as an afterthought. Just lunch, he said. Public place. No pressure. I told myself the same thing as I agreed. It was just lunch. People eat lunch every day. Colleagues do it all the time. Still, as I walked into the cafe and saw him waiting, standing when he noticed me, smiling like he'd been anticipating this moment all morning, my heart betrayed me. Seeing him outside the context of my home, or my phone changed everything. He looked familiar and knew all at once. We talked for hours. Not just about life, but about the things we'd never said to anyone else. Regrets. Missed chances. The quiet disappointments that don't sound dramatic enough to justify pain, but hurt anyway. At one point, he reached across the table and brushed his thumb against my hand. It was brief, gentle, easily dismissed. But neither of us pulled away. That was the moment I knew. Not that I loved him. Not even that I wanted him. But that I had crossed into territory where intention mattered more than circumstance. When we finally stood to leave, the air between us felt heavy, charged with things unsaid. I don't want to complicate your life, he said quietly. But I won't pretend this doesn't mean something. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. That night, Mark talked about his day. I listened, responded, played my part. But inside, my thoughts were somewhere else. With a man who didn't belong to me. And a life that no longer felt entirely mine. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again, just like that first night. Only this time, I didn't ask myself if I was doing something wrong. I asked myself how long I could live between two truths without breaking. After lunch with Daniel, I became acutely aware of how much of myself I was carrying in silence. Not the logistics. Not the lies, because there still weren't any, not in the traditional sense. It was the emotions that weighed the most. They followed me everywhere, settling into moments that used to be empty. Waiting in line at the grocery store. Folding laundry. Sitting in traffic. They pressed against my ribs, demanding acknowledgement, even when I tried to keep them contained. Daniel didn't push for more. That, again, was what made it harder. He didn't text constantly after our lunch. Didn't ask when we'd meet again. Didn't try to turn a moment into a pattern. Instead, he gave me space. And in that space, I felt the full gravity of what I was doing. I noticed Mark more, really noticed him, in a way that felt both tender and cruel. The crease between his brows when he concentrated. The way he still reached for me in his sleep. The familiar rhythm of our life together, built over years of shared history. History has weight. It presses down on every choice, reminding you that nothing happens in isolation. That love, once given, doesn't evaporate just because it changes shape. One evening, Mark came home unusually quiet. He moved through the apartment slowly, deliberately, as if carrying something heavy inside him. Long day? I asked. He nodded. One of those. We ate dinner in near silence. Not uncomfortable, but not connected either. Afterward, he sat beside me on the couch and rested his head against the back cushion, eyes closed. Do you ever feel like you're standing still while everything else moves? He asked suddenly. The question startled me. Yes, I said honestly. He exhaled. I thought so. We sat like that for a long moment, close but not touching. Two people sharing a feeling without fully understanding each other's version of it. Later that night, I lay awake again. This time not replaying moments with Daniel, but counting the ways my life had split into two parallel versions. One where I was a wife. One where I was someone being slowly discovered. And I was terrified of losing either. Daniel called the next day while I was out walking. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I answered without thinking. Hi, he said. I just wanted to hear how you're doing. I slowed my pace, letting people pass me. I'm conflicted, I admitted. I know, he said quietly. So am I. There was no accusation in his voice. No attempt to fix it. Just acknowledgement. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said. Least of all Mark. I believe you, Daniel replied. And I don't want to be the reason you lose something important. That sentence should have been my exit. A clean one. An honorable one. But instead of relief, I felt panic. Because if he stepped back, I would have to confront what I'd been avoiding. That the emptiness I felt existed independently of him. And I wasn't ready for that. Mark suggested a weekend getaway shortly after. A spontaneous idea, born from exhaustion more than romance. We need a break, he said. Just us. I agreed immediately. I told myself it was the right thing. A chance to reconnect. To remember why we chose each other in the first place. The trip was pleasant. We laughed. We talked more than usual. We touched more often. It felt like revisiting an old version of ourselves, familiar, comforting, slightly faded. And yet, even there, I felt divided. When Mark stepped out of the hotel room to grab ice, I checked my phone. A message from Daniel waited. I hope you're okay. I stared at it for a long time before replying. I am. I think. He didn't ask where I was. Didn't press for details. That's all any of us can be sometimes, he wrote back. That night, Mark held me closer than he had in months. His warmth was real. His presence grounding. And still, I felt a quiet ache, for someone who wasn't there. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't choosing between two men. I was choosing between comfort and truth, between a life that made sense on paper and a connection that felt alive. But truth isn't kind, and comfort doesn't come without cost. By the time we returned home, I knew something had to change. I just didn't know if I was strong enough to decide what. The thing about living in between choices is that eventually, something pushes you out of the middle. You don't decide when it happens. You don't prepare for it. It arrives disguised as an ordinary moment, and by the time you recognize it, you're already past the point of control. For me, it happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Mark texted to say he'd be home late again. A last-minute meeting. Another delay. I stared at the message longer than necessary, my thumb hovering over the screen, before replying with the usual reassurance. Okay, see you later. The apartment felt unusually quiet that evening. Not peaceful, empty. The kind of quiet that amplifies your thoughts instead of calming them. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there, people were moving through their lives with certainty, with direction. I wondered when I'd stop feeling that way. My phone buzzed. Daniel, can I see you? Just for a few minutes. I should have said no. Not because it was wrong. By then, I knew we were already past that, but because I felt something tightening inside me, like a warning. I don't think that's a good idea, I typed. There was a pause. Longer than usual. I understand, he replied. I just needed to ask. I set the phone down, heart pounding, and took a long sip of wine. 10 minutes later, the buzzer rang. I froze. My first thought was Mark. Panic flared sharp and immediate. But Mark had a key. The buzzer rang again. I walked to the door slowly, every step heavy with awareness. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I shouldn't have come. I could have closed the door. I didn't. Just a few minutes, I said, stepping aside. That was the moment balance broke. We didn't touch. Didn't kiss. Didn't do anything that could be labeled outright betrayal. And yet, the intimacy of that moment surpassed anything physical. We stood in my living room, the same space where Mark and I had built years of shared life, and spoke the truth out loud for the first time. I think about you more than I should, Daniel said, and I hate myself for it. So do I admitted. Silence filled the room, thick, undeniable. I don't want to be a secret, he continued, but I also don't want to force you into a decision you're not ready for. The honesty in his voice cracked something open in me. I feel like I'm lying even when I'm not saying anything, I said. Like my whole life has become an omission. He stepped closer, not touching, just enough to make his presence unmistakable. If you ask me to walk away, he said, I will. My throat tightened. Because if I asked that, I would lose something I wasn't prepared to grieve. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the table. Mark. Leaving now. Time snapped back into place. Daniel saw my expression change. He nodded slowly, understanding. I should go, he said. At the door he paused. This can't stay suspended forever, he said gently. None of us survived that. Then he left. I sank onto the couch, shaking. When Mark came home, I kissed him hello, asked about his day, listened, smiled, and hated myself for how normal it all felt. That night, I dreamed of standing on a bridge, water rushing beneath me, unable to move forward or back. When I woke, I knew the truth. The middle was collapsing. And soon something, or someone was going to get hurt. After Daniel left that night, the apartment felt smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the walls had moved in just enough to remind me there was no space left to hide. Every object carried meaning now. The couch where Mark and I sat every evening. The doorway Daniel had just walked through. The table where my phone still lay, face down, holding evidence of the life I was splitting in two. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I expected guilt to crash into me all at once, loud and overwhelming. Instead, what settled in was something quieter, heavier. Clarity. For the first time since this all began, I stopped asking myself what if and started asking how long. How long could I keep waking up beside a man who believed in a version of me that no longer existed? How long could I carry someone else in my thoughts without letting it reshape my marriage entirely? How long before silence turned into dishonesty, whether I wanted it to or not? Mark noticed something the next morning. Not the secret. Not the tension. The stillness. "You okay?" he asked as we sat across from each other at breakfast. "Yes," I said automatically. He studied me for a moment. "You seem far away." I looked down at my coffee. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "Us." The word hovered in my mind, heavy and fragile. "About life?" I said instead. He nodded, accepting that answer too easily. That was when I realized something that hurt more than guilt ever could. Mark wasn't ignoring the distance between us. He just didn't know how to approach it. And neither did I. Daniel didn't reach out after that night. Not a text. Not a call. Not even an email. At first, the silence felt like relief, a pause where I could breathe again. But as the days passed, it transformed into something sharper. Absence. I missed him in ways that startled me. Not his presence, but the version of myself that existed when I spoke to him. The honesty. The openness. The feeling of being fully awake. I began to understand something uncomfortable. Daniel wasn't the cause of my unhappiness. He was the contrast that revealed it. One evening, Mark and I sat together in the living room, the TV on but muted. He turned to me suddenly, his expression serious. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question hit me harder than Daniel's ever had. Because this time, it came from the man who had a right to the answer. "I don't know," I said. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in pain. "When did that change?" he asked. I searched my memory for a moment I could point to. A fight. A mistake. A single turning point. There wasn't one. "I think it happened slowly," I said. So slowly I didn't notice. He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. Those words should have anchored me. Instead, they made the weight heavier. Because love, when spoken like that, becomes responsibility. That night, I lay awake again, no phone buzzing this time, no messages waiting, just the truth pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't go back to before. And I couldn't stay where I was. Something had to give. The next morning, Daniel finally reached out. "I've been trying to give you space," he wrote. "But I need to know, are you okay?" I stared at the message for a long time. This time, I didn't respond immediately. I closed my eyes and asked myself the question I'd been avoiding since the beginning. What do I actually want? Not what felt exciting. Not what felt safe. Not what spared the most pain. What was true? When I finally replied, my hands were steady. "I don't know what happens next," I wrote. "But I can't keep pretending nothing is changing." The response came a few minutes later. "Then maybe it's time to stop pretending." I felt tears rise then, slow, inevitable. Because pretending had been the last thing holding everything together. And once it stopped, there was no telling what would fall apart. Once you admit the truth to yourself, it doesn't loosen its grip. It tightens. After that message to Daniel, I felt exposed, like I'd opened a window inside myself and couldn't close it again. The pretending had been exhausting, yes, but it had also been protective. Without it, every interaction felt sharper, more honest, more dangerous. Mark sensed it immediately. There was a carefulness in the way he spoke to me now, like he was afraid one wrong word might fracture something already cracked. He asked more questions, paid more attention, suggested small things, walks after dinner, shared meals without phones, weekends planned in advance. It would have meant everything to me 6 months earlier. Now, it felt like trying to rebuild a house while standing in the ruins of the old one. One evening, as we cleared the table together, Mark stopped and looked at me, really looked at me. "There's something you're not telling me," he said. My hands froze around a plate. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't anger. It was knowing. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I don't know how to say it, I whispered. He exhaled slowly and pulled out a chair, sitting down like he needed the support. Then start anywhere. I sat across from him, the distance between us suddenly vast. I've been unhappy, I said. Not because of one thing. Not because of something you did. Just unhappy. His jaw tightened. How long? He asked. I swallowed. Longer than I admitted to myself. He nodded, absorbing it. Processing. Is there someone else? He asked quietly. The room went still. This was it, the question I'd been outrunning since the beginning. I didn't answer immediately. That pause was answer enough. His face didn't change much. Just a subtle shift, like something heavy had settled into place. Have you slept with him? He asked. No, I said immediately. No. Never. It was the truth. And yet it felt insufficient. Do you love him? The word love echoed between us, enormous and fragile. I don't know, I said honestly. I know I feel seen. I know I feel alive. And I know I don't want to lie anymore. Mark closed his eyes, pressing his fingers to his temples. I wish you'd come to me sooner, he said, before it got this far. So do I whispered. Silence stretched between us, not hostile, not calm, just raw. I don't want to lose you, he said again. But I can't compete with someone who lives in your head. That sentence broke something in me. Because he was right. That night, we slept in the same bed but miles apart. No touching. No pretending. Just two people facing the truth of what they'd become. The next day, I met Daniel. Not secretly. Not impulsively. Deliberately. We sat across from each other in the same cafe as before. The familiarity now tinged with gravity. I told him, I said. Daniel's expression softened. How did he take it? As well as anyone could, I replied. Which somehow makes it worse. He nodded. What happens now? I took a deep breath. I don't know, I said. But I can't live half a life anymore. He leaned forward slightly. I don't want to be the escape, he said. I want to be the choice, or not at all. I appreciated him for that more than I could say. Because it meant whatever came next would be honest. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Not relief. Resolution. That evening, alone in the apartment, I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the life Mark and I had built. Memories surfaced uninvited. Laughter. Plans. Versions of us that had once fit perfectly. I sat on the floor and cried then, not for Daniel, not even for myself, but for the marriage that hadn't ended with betrayal, but with truth arriving too late. By the time I wiped my face and stood, I knew. Running was over. And whatever pain came next would at least be real. After that day, nothing could remain the same. Mark and I existed in the same apartment, shared meals and routine gestures, but the unspoken truth lingered between us like a shadow. It was not hostility, not resentment, just the quiet acknowledgement that life had shifted, and neither of us could return to the old version. I woke one morning and realized the weight of silence had been replaced with clarity. For the first time, I could look at my feelings without shame, not entirely, but enough to understand that avoiding them only prolonged the inevitable. I reached for my phone. Daniel's name appeared in the messages list. No notification badge. No urgency. Just presence. Morning, he wrote. Did you sleep? I typed back. I slept. Restless, but yes. That simple exchange carried more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. It was the beginning of honesty, raw, delicate, and uncompromising. Later that day, Mark came home. He smiled as he always did, his presence comforting yet distant. We sat across from each other at the dinner table, the space between us thick with things left unsaid. I've been thinking, he said slowly. About us. About everything. I nodded. silently acknowledging that it was the conversation we had both been avoiding. "I don't want this to end," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know how to fix it." Neither did I. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The truth was that my heart had been pulled in two directions, not by choice but by circumstance, longing, and the undeniable reality that Daniel had seen me in ways Mark no longer could. That night I made a decision. Not about love. Not about relationships. Not even about leaving or staying. I decided to choose honesty. To acknowledge my feelings without judgment. To honor the connection that had awakened a part of me I'd long ignored. To confront the void I had been filling with avoidance, distraction, and quiet denial. Daniel and I met again. This time, there were no hurried messages, no fleeting encounters, no whispered confessions across the table. We spoke openly, without hesitation, about what had been unfolding between us. About the way we had been drawn together by curiosity, by attention, by understanding. About the consequences, the risks, the moral complexities. "I don't want to be your secret," he said. "I don't want to be a reason for pain." I looked at him and felt the weight of every choice I had made. "Nor do I," I whispered. And in that acknowledgement, we found something rare. Clarity without absolution, connection without pretense. I returned home to Mark that evening, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilt in the way I had before. Instead, I felt respect for the truth. Respect for what had been. Respect for what existed now. And respect for the choices we all had to make moving forward. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't pretend the emotional fracture wasn't there. But we acknowledged it. And sometimes, acknowledgement is the first step toward healing. Sitting in the quiet of our apartment, I realized that life isn't about perfect decisions or flawless timing. It's about facing what you feel, owning it, and choosing how to move forward with integrity, even when the path is uncertain. Love, desire, loyalty, honesty, they don't always align neatly. They clash, overlap, and challenge every certainty we cling to. But in that struggle, I learned the most important lesson. The courage to face your truth, even when it terrifies you, is more powerful than any comfort offered by avoidance. As the city lights glimmered through the window, I understood finally that some connections change you forever. Not because they are easy or convenient, but because they demand honesty, courage, and an acceptance of imperfection. And that is where I stood. Not in certainty, not in resolution, but in the quiet, profound awareness that life, love, and truth are messy, and beautiful precisely because of it. Whatever came next, I would meet it awake. Fully awake. No pretense. No half-lives. No illusions. Only truth. And in that truth I was free.